When Jonathan Roumie walked through the doors of the Apostolic Palace on that crisp October morning in 2022, he carried with him the hopes and prayers of millions of fans who saw him not just as an actor, but as the living embodiment of Jesus Christ. What he didn't expect was to leave that meeting fundamentally changed, carrying a sacred responsibility that would redefine everything he thought he knew about his calling. Pope Francis, who rarely grants extended private audiences to entertainment figures, had specifically requested this meeting after watching the chosen episodes that had moved him to tears. But the conversation that followed wasn't about television, it was about Jonathan's soul, his purpose, and a divine mission that the Vatican believed only he could fulfill. The weight of what the Pope asked him to do would soon become evident in every scene Jonathan filmed thereafter. If you're watching this and haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to discover about Jonathan Roumie's secret Vatican encounter will transform your understanding of both the man and his divine calling. The journey to that historic October morning began 8 months earlier when Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, received an unusual request from Pope Francis himself that would set in motion one of the most extraordinary papal meetings in modern ecclesiastical history. The Holy Father had been watching the chosen during his evening prayers, a practice that had become deeply meaningful to him during the challenging years of global pandemic, social upheaval, and the spiritual drought that seemed to be affecting believers worldwide. Unlike the countless biblical films and television productions that had crossed his desk over the decades, from the Hollywood epics of the 1950s to the more recent attempts at faith-based entertainment, something about Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus had moved Pope Francis in ways that surprised even his closest advisors and confidants within the Vatican's inner circle. According to sources within the Apostolic Palace, who spoke on condition of anonymity, the Pope had been heard saying during his morning reflections with Cardinal Martinez that watching Jonathan's performance felt less like observing an actor reciting lines and more like witnessing a genuine spiritual encounter that transcended the boundaries of entertainment and entered the realm of authentic religious experience. The Holy Father had reportedly paused his busy schedule on multiple occasions to watch specific episodes, sometimes replaying scenes that particularly moved him, and had begun incorporating insights from Jonathan's portrayal into his own homilies and private spiritual direction sessions with visitors to the Vatican. The Pope's interest wasn't merely casual appreciation for well-crafted religious programming or a simple endorsement of faith-based entertainment. Cardinal Martinez, who serves as one of the Pope's principal advisors on cultural matters and has known the Holy Father since their days working together in Argentina, later confided to trusted colleagues that Pope Francis had experienced what he described as profound spiritual consolation while watching specific scenes from The Chosen, particularly those depicting Jesus' interactions with the marginalized and forgotten members of society. The episode depicting Jesus' compassion for the tax collectors, prostitutes, and social outcasts had reportedly moved the Holy Father to tears during his private viewing, but it was Jonathan's portrayal of Christ's moment of doubt and profound humanity in the Garden of Gethsemane that convinced Pope Francis that this actor possessed something rare and divinely inspired, something that could not be manufactured through acting technique alone. During a private conversation with his secretary, Monsignor Fabian Padacchio, Pope Francis had expressed his belief that Jonathan's performance represented a new form of evangelization that could reach souls who had been touched by neither traditional preaching nor conventional religious education. The Pope had spoken about the spiritual hunger he sensed in contemporary society, particularly among young adults who had grown up in an increasingly secular culture, but still carried deep yearnings for meaning, purpose, and authentic spiritual connection. In Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus, the Holy Father recognized a bridge between the ancient gospel message and the contemporary search for truth that characterized the modern spiritual landscape. In April 2022, an unprecedented invitation was quietly extended through carefully chosen intermediaries within the Vatican's Cultural Office and the Pontifical Council for Culture. The process involved months of discreet preliminary discussions, theological consultations, and careful consideration of the spiritual and pastoral implications of such a meeting. The Vatican's cultural office reached out to Jonathan's representatives through a complex network of Catholic entertainment industry contacts, including several prominent Catholic actors and directors who had previously met with Pope Francis and could vouch for the profound spiritual significance such an encounter might hold. The invitation itself came with unusual specifications that immediately signaled the extraordinary nature of this proposed encounter. The meeting would be completely private, with no press coverage, no photographers, no official Vatican announcements, and no records kept in the standard papal audience registry that tracks most visitor meetings. Even more remarkably, the audience would extend for a full 2 hours, an extraordinary allocation of papal time typically reserved for heads of state, senior Vatican officials, or matters of urgent ecclesiastical importance requiring extensive discussion and prayer. Jonathan's initial reaction, according to those close to him who were aware of the invitation, was a mixture of profound honor, overwhelming anxiety, and a deep sense of unworthiness that reflected his genuine humility and authentic faith. The weight of representing not just his own faith journey, but the spiritual hopes and expectations of millions of viewers around the world who had found renewed meaning in their relationship with Jesus through his portrayal, suddenly felt more real and substantial than ever before. Friends and spiritual advisors reported that Jonathan spent weeks grappling with questions about whether he was truly worthy of such an honor, whether his portrayal had been faithful enough to merit papal attention, and what this meeting might mean for his future role in the Chosen and his personal spiritual development. He spent those weeks preparing for the meeting, not through research about Vatican protocol or rehearsal of what he might say to the Holy Father, but through intensive prayer, fasting, and spiritual direction sessions with Father Michael O'Connor, his longtime confessor and spiritual director, who had guided Jonathan through his deepest questions about faith, vocation, and the intersection of artistic calling with religious commitment. Father O'Connor later described those weeks as a period of intense spiritual purification and preparation, as if Jonathan was preparing not just for an important meeting with a significant religious figure, but for a profound calling that would reshape his understanding of his life's purpose and mission. The logistics of the meeting were handled with the discretion and security typically reserved for the most sensitive diplomatic encounters involving international relations or matters of church doctrine. Jonathan flew to Rome under deliberately minimal circumstances, traveling on a commercial flight rather than private transportation, staying in a modest guest house run by Franciscan friars near St. Peter's Square, rather than the luxury accommodations typically provided for visiting celebrities or entertainment industry figures. His arrival at the Vatican was scheduled during a time when tourist activity was at its lowest early in the morning, before the museums opened, and the crowds began gathering in St. Peter's Square for the general audiences and public events that normally fill the Vatican's daily schedule. Jonathan was escorted through private corridors that even many Vatican officials rarely access, passages that connect the apostolic palace to various administrative buildings and private chapels within the Vatican complex. The Swiss guard who accompanied Jonathan on this journey later remarked that the actor's demeanor was unlike any celebrity visitor they had encountered in their years of service. He moved through the sacred spaces with the reverence and quiet awe of a genuine pilgrim, rather than the curiosity, excitement, or self-importance of a typical tourist or entertainment industry figure seeking papal blessing for their career or projects. The route to the papal chambers took Jonathan through some of the most historically and spiritually significant spaces in all of Christianity, including corridors lined with Renaissance frescoes depicting scenes from the life of Christ, past ancient chapels where popes had prayed for centuries, and through rooms where crucial decisions affecting the global Catholic Church had been made by successive pontiffs throughout the ages. Those who accompanied Jonathan reported that he seemed deeply moved by the weight of history and holiness that permeated every stone and artwork they passed, pausing frequently to pray silently before particularly meaningful religious images or sacred spaces. Pope Francis received Jonathan in his private study within the apostolic palace, a room deliberately furnished with simple wooden furniture and religious artifacts that reflected the Holy Father's well-known commitment to simplicity, authentic spirituality, and identification with the poor and marginalized rather than the ornate luxury that had characterized some previous papal apartments. The study contained a simple wooden desk, comfortable but unpretentious chairs, shelves lined with theological books and spiritual writings, and several personal religious artifacts, including a crucifix that had belonged to Pope Francis's grandmother and a small statue of Saint Joseph that had accompanied him from Argentina. The contrast between the humble Argentinian pope, dressed in his simple white cassock and speaking with the gentle accent of his homeland, and the American actor who had become the most recognizable face of Jesus in contemporary media, created a moment that the few witnesses present described as both deeply moving and profoundly significant for the future of Catholic engagement with popular culture. According to the very limited accounts available from Vatican sources who were present in adjacent rooms, Pope Francis began the conversation not with formal pleasantries about Jonathan's career or the success of the chosen, but with a simple and direct question that immediately established the spiritual depth and personal nature of their encounter. "Jonathan, tell me about your relationship with Jesus when the cameras aren't rolling." This question opened a conversation that Jonathan would later describe, in very general terms, as the most important and transformative 2 hours of his life, though he has remained remarkably discreet and respectful about the specific content of their discussion, consistently deflecting interview questions about details while emphasizing the profound personal impact the meeting had on his understanding of his calling and relationship with Christ. Vatican sources suggest that Pope Francis began by sharing with Jonathan his own understanding of what it means to represent Christ authentically in a world that desperately needs genuine spiritual leadership, drawing from his decades of pastoral experience ministering to the poor and marginalized in the slums of Buenos Aires before his election to the papacy. The Pope, who had spent his entire priesthood working directly with people who had been forgotten or rejected by society, spoke about the unique responsibility that comes with being a visible and influential symbol of Jesus' love, compassion, and message of hope to millions of people around the world. He shared insights from his own struggles with the weight of representing Christ through his papal office, the challenges of maintaining authentic spirituality while serving in such a public role, and the constant need for prayer, humility, and dependence on divine grace rather than human ability or achievement. But the conversation took an unexpected and sobering turn when Pope Francis began discussing what he called the spiritual warfare surrounding modern media portrayals of sacred figures and religious themes. According to sources familiar with the meeting, the Pope expressed his belief, based on decades of pastoral experience and his understanding of church history, that Jonathan's role in The Chosen was not merely an acting job or even an important form of religious education, but represented a form of modern evangelization that carried both extraordinary potential for spiritual good and significant spiritual risks that required serious consideration and preparation. The Holy Father spoke candidly about the attacks that often target those who publicly represent Christ, whether through preaching, teaching, writing, or artistic portrayal, explaining that such attacks could come through various means, including personal temptations, attacks on family relationships, health problems, financial difficulties, or attempts to discredit their ministry through scandal or controversy. Pope Francis warned Jonathan about the spiritual forces that would inevitably seek to undermine both his personal faith and his public witness, emphasizing the need for constant vigilance, regular spiritual direction, frequent reception of the sacraments, and a strong support network of faithful Catholic friends and advisors. The Pope also discussed the particular challenges faced by those who portray Jesus in film or television, noting that such roles could potentially lead to spiritual pride, confusion between the actor's identity and the character they portray, or the temptation to begin believing that their success in the role indicated some special spiritual status or superiority. He emphasized the crucial importance of maintaining humility, recognizing that any effectiveness in portraying Christ came entirely from divine grace rather than human talent, and remembering that the goal of such portrayals should always be to point others toward the real Jesus, rather than drawing attention to the actor or actress. The most significant and sacred moment of their encounter came when Pope Francis offered to provide Jonathan with what Vatican sources describe as a personal apostolic blessing. Not the standard blessing typically given to visitors during general audiences or routine meetings, but a specific consecration and commissioning for his particular role as a portrayer of Jesus Christ in contemporary media. This type of blessing, according to those familiar with Vatican protocol and papal traditions, is extremely rare and signifies the Church's formal recognition of a particular calling or mission that extends beyond typical professional or personal endeavors. The ceremony of this blessing was conducted with the solemnity and reverence typically reserved for the ordination of priests or the commissioning of missionaries for particularly challenging or important assignments. Pope Francis instructed Jonathan to kneel in the small chapel adjacent to his study, a sacred space where popes have prayed for centuries and where many crucial decisions affecting the global Church have been brought before God in prayer and contemplation. The Holy Father then placed his hands on Jonathan's head and prayed in Latin for several minutes, asking for divine protection, wisdom, spiritual strength, and the grace to faithfully represent Christ's love, truth, and mercy to the world through his artistic gifts and public platform. The prayer, according to those present, included specific petitions for protection against spiritual attacks, preservation from the temptations of pride and worldly success, growth in personal holiness and authentic relationship with Jesus, and effectiveness in using his role to draw others closer to Christ and the Catholic Church. Pope Francis also prayed for Jonathan's family, his co-workers on The Chosen, and the millions of viewers around the world who would be influenced by his portrayal, asking that the series would serve as a genuine instrument of evangelization and spiritual formation, rather than mere entertainment. However, the most mysterious and intriguing aspect of their entire meeting remains the sealed envelope that Pope Francis personally handed to Jonathan as their conversation and prayer time concluded. Vatican sources confirm that such personal written communications from the Pope are extremely unusual and typically reserved for matters of the highest spiritual significance, such as private instructions to papal nuncios, personal spiritual direction for individuals facing extraordinary challenges, or confidential guidance sensitive church matters that require discretion and careful handling. The envelope itself, according to those who observed the exchange, was made of heavy paper bearing the papal seal and was clearly intended to be opened privately rather than in the presence of others. Vatican protocol officers who were briefly present during the conclusion of the meeting reported that Pope Francis presented the envelope to Jonathan with particular solemnity, instructing him to read its contents only in prayer and to keep its message confidential, unless specifically guided otherwise through spiritual direction and discernment. The contents of that envelope have never been revealed publicly, though those close to Jonathan report that he keeps it in a private prayer space in his home, where he maintains a small altar with religious artifacts, spiritual books, and items connected to his portrayal of Jesus. Friends and spiritual advisors have observed that Jonathan refers to the envelope's contents regularly, especially during difficult periods of filming, personal struggles, or when making important decisions about his career and future involvement with The Chosen. Some have speculated that the envelope contains specific spiritual guidance for Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus, possibly including insights about particular aspects of Christ's character or mission that Pope Francis wanted to emphasize. Others have suggested that it might contain warnings about specific temptations or challenges that Jonathan might face, along with spiritual strategies for maintaining his faith and effectiveness in his role. A few have even theorized that the Pope might have shared prophetic insights about the future impact of The Chosen or Jonathan's role in the broader evangelization efforts of the Catholic Church in the 21st century. The immediate and dramatic impact of the Vatican meeting became evident almost immediately upon Jonathan's return to The Chosen production in Texas, where cast and crew members who had worked with him for several years noticed profound and unmistakable changes in his approach to the role and his interactions with everyone involved in the production. Directors reported that Jonathan seemed to possess a new depth of understanding about the character of Jesus that enhanced every scene he filmed, bringing layers of meaning and authenticity that surprised even the show's creators and writers who thought they knew the full scope of his abilities as an actor. His co-stars began describing a sense of genuine reverence and spiritual presence when working with him in scenes, as if his portrayal had transcended the boundaries of professional performance and entered the realm of authentic spiritual witness and ministry. Elizabeth Tabish, who portrays Mary Magdalene, and had developed a close working relationship with Jonathan throughout the series, reported that acting opposite him after his Vatican visit required her to deepen her own spiritual preparation for their scenes together because of the increased intensity and authenticity he brought to his portrayal of Christ. Camera operators and sound technicians, who typically become desensitized to repeated takes and technical requirements during long production days, found themselves moved to tears during Jonathan's post-Vatican performances, even during routine setup shots and technical rehearsals. The scenes depicting Jesus's teachings carried a weight and spiritual authority that seemed to transform the entire atmosphere on set, creating an environment that many described as feeling more like a sacred space than a television production facility. Even non-religious crew members, including several who had previously been skeptical or indifferent toward the spiritual themes of the show, reported experiencing a sense of peace, spiritual presence, and even personal conversion during Jonathan's post-Vatican filming sessions. These effects were so pronounced and consistent that the production team began quietly documenting what they observed, creating an unofficial record of the transformative impact of Jonathan's Vatican experience on everyone involved in the production. The changes weren't limited to his professional performance, but extended to his entire approach to life, faith, and his relationships with others. Friends and family members noticed that the Vatican meeting had affected Jonathan's personal spiritual practices, his charitable involvements, and his perspective on fame and success in the entertainment industry. He developed a new intensity in his prayer life, often spending hours in contemplation before filming particularly important scenes, and demonstrated a deeper commitment to charitable work, particularly ministries focused on youth, families struggling with addiction, and organizations serving the poor and marginalized. Jonathan began declining certain social invitations and entertainment industry events that he had previously attended, preferring to spend his free time in prayer, reading spiritual texts, studying church history and theology, and meeting with people who sought his counsel, prayer, or spiritual guidance. This shift in priorities reflected his growing understanding of his role not just as an actor portraying a religious figure, but as someone called to authentic Christian witness and ministry through his public platform and influence. Perhaps most significantly, Jonathan began displaying what those around him described as an uncanny ability to provide exactly the spiritual guidance, encouragement, or insight that people needed, even when he couldn't have known their specific circumstances, personal struggles, or spiritual questions through normal means. Crew members dealing with personal crises, family problems, health issues, or spiritual doubts found themselves naturally drawn to seek him out for conversation, and consistently reported that his words seemed to address their deepest needs with surprising precision, wisdom, and compassion. Today, nearly 2 years after that transformative October morning, when Jonathan Roumie walked into the apostolic palace, carrying the hopes and prayers of millions, the full impact of his meeting with Pope Francis continues to resonate throughout the global Christian community and beyond. The sacred responsibility that the Holy Father entrusted to Jonathan has been faithfully carried through every subsequent episode of The Chosen, transforming not just how audiences view the series, but how they understand the possibility of encountering Christ through contemporary media and artistic expression.